Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for Survive podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor James F. McGrath, and we're going to be talking about his new book, which came out recently, The A to Z of the New Testament Things Experts Know That Everyone Else Should Too. The link to purchase his book is in the description below. And that being said, can you tell us a bit about what is your new book about? And we'll go from there.
Right. So this book came about at the intersection of an invitation from a publisher to write a question and answer book about the New Testament. What are the things that people ought to know, things that scholars take for granted? We might even forget to mention them if we're teaching on the subject. And the things that ordinary people in the street who have some, general notions about the New Testament, people who maybe have gone to church their whole life but have only heard it in sermons, they encounter this scholarly viewpoint, this discussion about authorship, something about cultural context, all these kinds of things. And they're like, why have I never heard this before? And it's long been a desire of mine to write a book that actually set those things out, but did so in a way that didn't require you to have a lot of, or really have any prior exposure to academic biblical studies, or the kind of motivation that's sometimes needed to work through a textbook, right? Because most things in life we could teach ourselves if we got a book, we looked up videos, but often that takes a fair amount of intrinsic motivation, shall we say. And so this was an attempt to sign. Did I cut out there for a second?
Yes, you did, for like 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds.
Okay. What did you last hear? I'll pick it up from there.
Let me see.
Yeah, they say being hardwired into the internet is better, but even that isn't always a guarantee that things will go smoothly, I guess.
Yeah, I think what you were talking about, what led you to writing the book, and
most of that vanished.
Yeah, it was around that.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's basically an attempt to take the stuff that I teach in an intro course, let's say, that most scholars would introduce you to in a course on the New Testament, and present it in a fun way so you don't have to be in a situation in which you're doing it for a grade and therefore you have something else that's motivating you, kind of pushing you to work through a textbook that might otherwise not be all that much fun. And so just tried to introduce some levity and comedy where appropriate, maybe sometimes where not appropriate, but to use analogies to bring in everyday relatable things and to work inductively. So start right, rather than go like book by book or subject by subject, start with something puzzling or something interesting or something that people may have heard, and either question it or ask what's behind it. And in that way, introduce people not just to the conclusions we draw, but also how we reach them as scholars.
And when it comes to looking at trying to familiarize readers with the basic facts of the New Testament, like the dating of Paul's letters, looking at the synoptic problem, you try to break all that down to the basics, in which you try not to make it too complicated, and you try to break it down in simpler terms so that the basic layman can understand.
Yes, so there are great depths into which anyone who's interested can dig into the subjects that I explore in this book in, I wouldn't say a superficial way, but an introductory way, right? The way you get them in first encounter, not like first encounter in sort of kindergarten level or that sort of thing, but as you might get them at a university, at a level that people in high school, right, cover religious studies in the UK. And that was one of the things that was an inspiration for this book. The fact that in the UK, teenagers are encountering things that you can spend your whole life in a church or whole life discussing the New Testament but never studying in a formal way. And you never hear about these things, right? Unless you go and actively inform yourself. And so I think that often, whether it's religious fundamentalists, whether it's mythicists, all the different groups that we've talked about, I think, on this channel before, when we're talking about and encountering the misunderstandings of the New Testament in the general populace, I think often it's because both of those groups and many others like them have the same approach, which is to go and just look for, dive into the New Testament, just looking for evidence of this or that, looking for a keyword that says this or that, but not getting a sense of the whole, not getting a sense of the overall historical context, not getting a sense of what do we know when we put the different pieces of the life of Jesus together. What can we figure out when we don't just dip into Paul asking, did he believe in a historical Jesus or not? But who was he? How did he understand himself? How did his recipients understand him? What can we deduce about his recipients and about this movement they were part of from the things that he wrote? And so that kind of big picture stuff, when that's missing, oftentimes that's what leads to people doing very, very puzzling and sometimes very, very problematic things with the New Testament.
Can you talk about plagiarism in the Gospels?
Sure, yeah. And that's in there partly because I'm an educator. And so I was talking with my students about plagiarism. And one of the reasons I tell them I'm particularly good at catching plagiarism is because one of the subjects that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the relationship between the Gospels. And what does it look like when somebody's copying directly versus when somebody's just knows the same material or saw the same event and is writing about it independently. And that's really what we're dealing with in the New Testament. Now, of course, I emphasize to them, and I emphasize in the book, that what we mean by plagiarism didn't exist then, right? So there were no footnotes, there weren't quotation marks, lots of things that we take for granted were not around when these texts were written. And so we shouldn't expect them to have those things, and we shouldn't hold them to that standard. But even by thinking about it in relation to plagiarism, what's involved in copying? What does copying look like? What do people do when they're trying to cover up their copying, right? They often change a few words here and there, right? And that's what ancient authors often did when they're using sources. And so despite the fact that there's occasional difference of wording, we can still see this large scale as well as detailed dependence of one gospel on another and figure out which one wrote first. And that's important to understanding them. It's important to figuring out the history, which of these texts brings us closer to the historical Jesus, let's say, and also figuring out what each one's emphasizing, right? If we think that Luke left out something that's in Matthew, or if we think that Matthew added something that's not in Luke, if we get the order wrong and which one is leaving out or which one is adding, we get that wrong, then we're going to misunderstand what's going on and what the author of the text is doing. So these are things that are not just questions to satisfy some curiosity that scholars have, but they're actually directly relevant to understanding these texts. And that's why I wrote the book, and that's one of the things I hope that people who read it will get and take away from it.
How is Paul's letters a telephone game exactly?
Yeah, so I don't like that analogy. There are two ways in which people talk about the telephone game as an analogy. So on the one hand, you'll hear people sometimes talk about the process of copying or of passing on oral tradition, like the telephone game. And I don't know about you, but when we played the telephone game as a kid, it was only when a teacher made us in order to illustrate something or to keep us busy for a while. And there was always somebody who deliberately changed things, thinking it was funny, right? And when we're dealing with something like oral tradition, these things are circulating in various directions, right? So it's not just one person to the next person to the next person. Scribal copying is sometimes a bit more like that, but even then, multiple manuscripts were often around in any particular place. But understanding Paul's letters is a lot like a different aspect of using a telephone, which is listening in on one end of a telephone conversation. And so we've all done it. We've been in a room where somebody is getting a phone call, and they might mention that they'll be like, "Oh yeah, sure, he's here. Yeah, sure, he'd be happy to. Yeah, I thought that was funny too." And you're standing there trying to figure out what's going on. And if the conversation goes on long enough or enough specifics are mentioned, you can figure that out, right? And so, for instance, the letters that we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians are actually most likely 2nd and 4th Corinthians. And in Paul's earliest letter to the Corinthians that we still have, right, which wasn't his first letter to them, he mentions specifically things that they wrote to him about. And so he's responding to them. And without that other side of the conversation, it's really difficult to understand these letters. But we can figure out ways of doing it. And making that analogy, realizing that we only have half of a conversation, is often the key to knowing how to approach this text, knowing why it's puzzling, right? I mean, it's not just self-evident that you would say some of the things that Paul says in there. They are direct responses to things that he knew that were communicated to him by members of this religious group in Corinth, which we don't have access to. And so we have to deduce from what Paul wrote.
Do we know exactly just how many of Paul's letters didn't survive?
No, we don't. There are a couple of references to those Corinthian letters. In one place, there's a reference to a letter to the Laodiceans, but whether that's an actual, right? Somebody actually did compose one. We also have a 3rd Corinthians because the church tried to make up for what was missing and what we knew was missing. But we have no idea whether Paul wrote any additional letters, whether there was small correspondence. And so we may be missing letters that Paul did actually write, and we may have in the New Testament letters attributed to him that he didn't actually write. And anyone who's asking historical questions about the New Testament and its literature have to ask about those things. What we're missing, unless we're actually told that something's missing, we can largely ignore because we can only speculate. Whether the things that we have are in fact authentic, that is crucially important if we're trying to figure out, how did Paul think? If we bring in a letter that's not actually by him and make it part of how we reconstruct his thought, it will change the way we reconstruct it and the way we interpret some of the letters that are authentic.
And to that end, how do we know that some of Paul's letters are authentic and some others are not? How does one distinguish between one from the other?
Yes, and that's a fantastic question, and it's something I explore in the book. Again, not going into the kind of detail that it's possible to go into with lots of statistics about how frequently words occur, looking at every example of how particular words are used and how they're different, let's say, between the generally accepted authentic letters and some of the ones that are thought to have been forged in Paul's name. As for how we know letters are authentic, part of that is just the fact that unless Paul was a letter writer, right, unless there were letters of Paul, the fact that we have letters forged in his name would be inexplicable, right? And so the fact that he wrote letters is a given. And then we start with the question of what is likely to be forged, right? And certain texts have certain characteristics when they are written later and are trying to allow an earlier authority figure speak to later events. And we see that in some of the letters that are viewed as inauthentic, right? So in the last days, scoffers will come, false teachers will arise, and they will do this, that, and the other. And so the author, whoever the actual author is claiming to be Paul, and then letting Paul address those later issues. In some of the letters, we don't have any of that, right? And it really does strike us as occasional correspondence by this individual. And so, as with so many things in history, as with just about everything in history, we don't have proof in the sort of mathematical sense or the scientific sense, right? The kinds of things that you can demonstrate in a chemistry lab, right, where you do the same experiment over and over again. In history, we don't have that. And so it's just simply a question of what's probable. And that, too, is something I explore in the book, that oftentimes people are looking for certainty, right? Either that we can trust everything that's in this book, or this collection of books, we should call it, this collection of literature, or we should be able to just dismiss it all as all invented. And what the historian does is look at each piece of evidence and evaluated on its own terms.
And can you expand on how that works? If it's difficult to know, um, if it's difficult to reconstruct and to know what happened in the ancient past, how does one sort through it and determine what is most probably correct and what is not?
Yeah. Again, great question. And in a lot of in most areas of history, if something doesn't look like there's any reason anyone would have forged it later, it will probably be assumed to be authentic. And to people who've had a bad experience with religious authority figures lying to them and using the Bible to do so, that can seem like just unacceptably risky. And I sympathize with that. But the truth is that we have letters where Paul clearly assumes that he's going to be among those, or at least he or the readers in Thessalonica are going to be among those who are alive when Jesus returns. If we get back to a later time, somebody who's forging is not going to say that, right? And we actually see this. One reason why Second Thessalonians is viewed as less likely to be an authentic letter is that it seems so much like First Thessalonians, and yet it seems to have this different view about how things are going to end. In Galatians, right, we have Paul trying to bolster his own authority over against the Jerusalem apostles, who he thinks have reneged on an agreement that he had with them. He thought that they were on the same page, and now some people are coming from there and are claiming that, in fact, authorities like James, the Lord's brother, are not in agreement with Paul and don't approve of what he's teaching, particularly about not being circumcised, not needing to be circumcised in order to be part of this movement, to become part of the family of Abraham. And so things like that, if we think about the Gospels by way of analogy, the fact that we have discussions in there of certain kinds of things that Rabbinic Judaism discusses about the application of particular laws that reflect those things, that later Gentile churches had no interest in and were not likely to become aware of, that there too we see that there are things that, whenever the text reached the form in which we now have it, there's material that's embedded in there that comes from a much earlier phase. And so, it's much the same way that somebody evaluates, the testimony of somebody in a trial, right? And when we have no reason to think that somebody is lying, we are often inclined to think they're telling the truth. We look for other evidence that we can coordinate. And the way we see Paul's arguments developing, the way we see the debates about Torah observance in Gentile Christianity unfolding over the early centuries, when we see some of these things settled and taken for granted, when some of these letters and other works start to be quoted by other individuals, all of those things allow us to assess the probability of authenticity of various writings.
And how do we know that Paul's epistles, the authentic letters, were written before the Jewish War?
Yeah, well, part of it is just that there's no indication of awareness of the Jewish War, right? There seems to be allusion to it occasionally in the Gospels. The question of whether, on the one hand, the prediction of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that we get in Mark 13 and parallels reflect knowledge of that, or whether the fact that it says things like, there won't be one stone left on another, and in fact, there are still stones one on another from the temple complex, indicates that this was crafted before those events. It's, again, weighing those kinds of probabilities. Paul is discussing opening up Judaism, opening up the people of God, the family of Abraham, to uncircumcised foreigners. And doing that in the time that we perceive Paul to have been doing it would have been controversial enough. Doing it around the time of the Jewish War or in the aftermath would have required addressing some other things, right? We can trace the development of Jewish nationalism and sentiment and things like that. And so, again, a lot of it is correlating with our knowledge of the time, right? The other literature that we have and what we know about events and what makes sense in one time period, one particular year or decade over against another.
How do we know that Mark is the first gospel, and when do the four gospels date?
So the four gospels, I'm trying to remember who it was who first described them as like, the dating of them as being like four really drunk men, walking down the street arm in arm, and nothing is supporting any of them. But when one of them moves, they all sort of shift in one direction or the other. And so figuring out that question of dependence, is crucial. And I often have students who will come into a course, if I ask them, say you have to try and figure out the order of dependence, like which of the gospels is dependent on the other. And they'll sometimes go to like a dictionary article and say, well, Matthew must be dependent on Mark because Mark was the first gospel. But actually that's a deduction from the text, right? So we start by trying to figure out which came first and then try to figure out when it's likely to have been written. Thinking that Mark is first, there are a number of arguments, and it again depends, you can go into this in a lot of detail. There's some great sources online that will guide you through this thing that's known as the synoptic problem. But ultimately, Matthew follows Mark's order for the most part. Luke's gospel follows Mark's order for the most part. And when Matthew or Luke departs from Mark's order, the other one doesn't tend to follow. And that's one of the reasons why Mark being first seems to make a lot of sense. Mark often has things in a less polished form. And so we see Matthew and Luke both correcting things. Now, I always point out to my students that that's not a foolproof argument, right? They regularly read, right? I regularly have students who will read something in a text that was perfectly clear, and what they write on the basis of that is less clear, right? So it does happen. But that said, right, looking at which is more probable that somebody added in a deep, came upon a story about Jesus healing someone all in one go and added in him having to do a first attempt, and the person says, "I see people like trees walking," right? There are lots of specific individual cases in which it looks like it just seems more likely that you would take what's in Mark and change it to what's in Matthew and change it to what's in Luke rather than vice versa. And so that's really how the argument proceeds. From there, it's really just a question of figuring out, does there seem to be knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 in the Jewish War? Those who think there is date Mark after 70, right? Or maybe just in the run-up to it, so that you're close enough that you could foresee potentially that some of these things might happen. One thing that makes it more difficult to know is that there's earlier stuff embedded in there. And so we have to look for what's the latest thing that gives us when it was written, right? Some of the stuff that's about the desolating sacrilege being set up in the holy place probably reflects the crisis during the reign of Caligula when he wanted to put his statue in the temple, right? And there are some things in Paul's letters that also seem like they might be aware of that and concerned with those sorts of issues. So again, it's a combination of correlating them with one another and then trying to correlate them with what's going on in the wider society as well. And I realize, I'm sure that for many people listening to this, that doesn't sound very precise, but of course that's what history entails. Sometimes we have very clear-cut cases, but more often than not, even if you dig some physical evidence out of the ground, it's not self-explanatory what it means. Right? It needs interpretation, it needs discussion, and it needs to be correlated with other things in order to figure out what its significance is.
What is the difference between Paul's Eucharist and the one we see in the Gospels?
his Eucharist. And for Paul, right, there certainly is this idea of participation in Christ and the body of Christ. And we don't really know how widespread that was, right? Because Paul wrote so many letters that have come to make up so much of the New Testament, it's very hard to know. He does say in his first letter to the Corinthians, as we know it, right, when we call First Corinthians, that he passed on to them what he also received, right? And it's the same tradition that we find in the Gospels, that Jesus, on the night he was betrayed or handed over, did something symbolic with bread and with wine. And it's in Luke and Paul that we get this idea of it being commemorative of Jesus' death. Do this in remembrance of me. Lots of things that become part of Eucharistic practice are not all across the gospel tradition. That said, it's not clear that any of them had a different Eucharistic tradition, right? If you read the work known as the Didache, which is outside the New Testament, it has a very different set of words, explanatory words around the bread and the wine. The four Gospels converge on this. Whether they all treated it the same way, whether they all had the same practice of sharing a full meal together in which Jesus was commemorated, that's a much harder question to answer, because we just have hints, for instance, in Paul's letters, and we only know the little we do about what was happening in Corinth because of the fact that Paul got wind that there were divisions among them. They were separated, probably physically separated at different tables, with reflecting different social statuses, and that this was dividing their meal and thus symbolically dividing the body of Christ, which in Paul's view is unacceptable. But I think for a lot of people in the early Christian movement, that eating together was itself something that they felt connected with Jesus, because it was about bringing people together across divisions that usually separated people in the society. And in particular, if you ever had a meal, right, those people would not sit together, would not eat together, would not be served the same food. And so Christian meals, whether commemorating Jesus' words at the Last Supper and recalling those things or not, had that symbolic significance that was part of that wider project that we know of as early Christianity.
We got a super chat question. Jason Kukulu, thank you for your super chat. What do scrolls from Herculaneum and Pompeii tell us about the oldest Pauline versus Gospels?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, and I'm not sure there's anything that I'm aware of from those scrolls that would help us figure out whether the letters of Paul were the oldest versus the Gospels, or which of those was the oldest. I mean, certainly we have fragments of things from places like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, and there, because of the dry climate, we have some very, very early fragments of things. And it was just in the news recently that there was a papyrus fragment that was published. It was known to exist, right, in a collection for a while, but it was only published recently. And it might be part of a Greek Gospel Thomas. It might be a previously unknown gospel. We're not sure. But it had material that was sayings of Jesus with some overlap with things we find in the New Testament, but not entirely. And so whether, they have this project to try to read, and they're making some initial progress reading some of those recovered scrolls that were charred and things. Oh dear, did I go again?
Yeah, you did. Your last words were something about finding scrolls that are charred.
Yeah, so they've been doing some scientific work to read those charred scrolls from Pompeii in particular, right? And Herculaneum, and to be able to decipher them, right, where they're unlegible, they're just black, right? I mean, there's no hope of reading them and you can't unroll them, they would fall to bits. And they've been figuring out ways to get some text off of them. And it's entirely possible that there will be things there as they proceed with study that may have some relevance to Christianity. That's still in its early phases. And so I feel bad that somebody did a super chat question where I have not really much yet as far as I'm aware. And there may be other people, right? This is, that's not something that's covered in an intro class. And I'm much more of a Gospels, historical Jesus, John the Baptist person than a Paul person. And so if you get somebody on who works on Paul and or those scrolls, you should give this person a chance to ask that question to them for free.
What is a critic in New Testament studies?
Yeah, so it means something not unlike what critic started out meaning. But if we talk about people being critics, right, we have the term critical, which can mean kind of scientific and detailed, but more often than not means, seeming to be unnecessarily negative, right? Why do you got to criticize me? Everybody's a critic. And it's a stereotype that, the critics, of films are people who want to be actors, they weren't good enough, so they write about film. And, and whether it's just actors, who are disgruntled saying that, or whether there's some truth in that, it's often hard to pin down. But the popular usage of the word critic often leads people to be, when they hear about historical criticism, literary criticism, to think that it's something that is a sort of a negative activity, rather than trying to do with the New Testament what you'd want a really good literary critic to do with a novel, what you'd want a really good movie.
Okay, the freeze is over. You were mentioning
I just was
the
checking
word.
whether when I was trying to get the sound working, whether I pulled on something else. So I was just checking.
Yeah, you mentioned novel, something like that. You stopped at the word novel or around that.
Okay. Yeah. So if you had somebody who's a literary critic talking about a novel, right? You have a film critic who's talking about a movie. What you want them to do, right, hopefully, is not necessarily say exactly what you thought when you saw the movie, if you've seen it already, but to share insightful things, maybe to get you to think about it in new ways, to notice things you hadn't noticed before. And even if you disagree with them in terms of how you interpret it or what was significant to you in the film, if you hadn't seen it yet and then go see it and you get a totally different impression, you still notice more as a result, right? What you're looking for is somebody who paid close attention and who shared their experience with you. And that's what New Testament criticism in all its forms does. Pay close attention. If it's literary criticism, then we're looking at the text as literature. And so we're asking, what are these characters like, right? What's the setting? And how does that convey something symbolic? Or what does it do? The pace of the narrative, how does that work? The order that things are placed in, which doesn't tell you whether any of that is based in anything historical, right? And so there's also historical criticism, which asks about whether these texts can in any way serve as a window onto events that happened earlier that may have influenced them and maybe recorded in them, or those events may be inspiration for a narrative that actually partly illuminates and reveals, but partly obscures something that actually happened in history. Then there are other things like textual criticism, where we try to figure out, what did the originals look like? Right? We don't have the original texts of any of these works. We don't have the original texts of almost anything from ancient history, and so that's not unusual. Our copies here are quite early, but they're still not the originals, and so we need to compare them. And so all of these things are ways in which people with particular areas of focus, particular research areas of expertise, look closely at some question or approach the text in some specific way and do it faithfully and with close attention to detail, and then pass on that information to readers of their books, to scholars, and I've tried to distill some of that in my book.
Can you tell us a bit about the use of the Old Testament in the New?
Yeah, and we've tried to move away from that language, right? Because Christians think of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, whatever one wishes to call them, as something that's just a precursor to the New Testament, right? And in actual fact, what we're talking about when we talk about the Old Testament, right, in quotation mark, in the New Testament, we're talking about the only scriptures, right, the Bible of the early church, right? The texts that you read in the New Testament, when people were first reading them, those were not scripture yet. They did not have that status. And so that in itself is an important point that I make in the book, and that's often leads to people misunderstanding these texts. If you can't read Paul's letter and take its argument on its own terms without it being scripture, then you're not going to hear it the way the first hearers did. In terms of what people do, like what the New Testament authors do with those biblical texts, the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, it varies. Often they're looking for things in those texts that can help them make sense of what happened with Jesus, particularly make sense of the crucifixion, right? That's a real challenge. Matthew's gospel is one that I focus a lot of attention on because he talks a lot about fulfillment of prophecy. And if we take that to mean prediction, right, so that there are messianic predictions in the original texts of Isaiah, of Hosea, of Jeremiah, and then Jesus, lo and behold, his life unfolds according to what's predicted, then when we read those texts in their original context, we realize we'd have to say Matthew is pulling a fast one, because those texts are not messianic predictions. They're not about Jesus in the original context. Out of Egypt I called my son, right, in Hosea 11. It's when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. I don't think Matthew's doing something deceptive there, personally, because I don't think he would have been able to get away with it if he had. I think what he's doing is something that's more like typology. So he's showing that in the story of Jesus, there are echoes of, there's this recapitulation of, these parallels with the story of Israel. And he's finding deeper significance in both by connecting the two. But yeah, again, whole books have been written on the subject of the use of the Old Testament in the New. And this book gives a bit of an introduction so that you do one of the most important things, which is to look up those texts in the original context and to ask, how does the meaning in the original context relate to the brief quotation that we have here? Sometimes it's crucial to it. Sometimes it might seem like the text is being taken out of context. And we shouldn't shy away from that, right? It certainly does seem in many instances that that's in fact what's going on. So each case is a little bit different, but there's some patterns that we can detect across this literature.
Biggie, thank you for your super chat. Can you talk about Paul's long hair?
Ooh, yes. So there's this passage in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians where he's saying something about women either having their hair a certain way or having their heads covered, and talks about what's natural and says something like, judge for yourselves, and whether it's shameful for a woman to have short hair, for a man to have long hair, things like that. And what I think is particularly interesting is that in the book of Acts, we have a story about Paul after spending time in Corinth, and then he goes to the port city of Cenchrea, which is the port near to Corinth where he would have sailed from. And it says while he was there, he had his head shaved because of a vow he had taken, right? So clearly he had taken what's known as a Nazirite vow, right? There's this vow that's mentioned in Numbers, right, in the Jewish scriptures. And it involved not consuming fermented beverages, grape products for a particular period of time, and not cutting one's hair. And then whenever you fulfilled the vow, right, so you, I think the analogy I make is to one of my several friends references, right? I say it's like Phoebe's friend, right, who played the steel drums at the the wedding. She says she'll shower when Tibet is free, right? So she's made a vow and said, I'm not doing this until this happens. And so Paul had done something along those lines. We don't know what the vow was, but according to Acts, he had done something of that sort. And I think that's interesting to bring into discussions of the passage in 1 Corinthians, because like, what if Paul had longer hair, right? What if he had been letting his hair grow while he was in Corinth? Does that have any relevance to how we understand that letter and what he means there? It's a very difficult passage. And in a lot of most parts of the English-speaking world, it's not a major focus. But I lived in Romania for several years, and there it's a big issue, whether women cover their heads, what they do with their hair, things of that sort. And so even thinking about that, we realize that the same issues are not treated in the same way in different cultures.
I've got a question from Barton Bangs. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Sorry if I didn't. Why aren't there any books in the New Testament from Gentiles? Were they forbidden to write, or did they write and prejudiced by later readers rejected their writings?
Yeah, it's an really interesting question. I think a lot of it is just the fact, right? And I did want to say that I wish I had Paul's long hair. But before we move on to the next topic, but I do think that most of it just has to do with the fact that the earliest movement was a Jewish movement, right? And eventually you have people coming into it, but the leaders in it, right, are people who were there from the beginning. And then you have people like Paul, who is able to assert himself because he has a dramatic experience. He'd previously been an opponent of this, and he has a fair amount of learning in the Jewish scriptures, which are the Bible of this movement. And so it's not a. There are a few instances, right, particularly in cases where we have things that are forged in Paul's name, where it's possible that it was by somebody who wasn't Jewish. It's not a given that the people to whom the Gospels are attributed are in fact the authors. And so that leaves some possibility there. The question of whether Luke was Jewish or not Jewish, given if Luke, the person referred to by Paul, was the same person, there's uncertainty about that. So it's not as clear cut as it might seem, but it definitely does seem to be the case that most of these texts are by Jewish authors. And I would say most of these texts are Jewish texts, because this was a Jewish movement. By the time we get to the end of the New Testament period, the period in which this literature is being written, we're still at most dealing with a huge influx of non-Jews into a Jewish movement, right? We're not dealing with something that is predominantly a Gentile movement yet. And to the extent that that's happening in some places, it's happening late in the process and a bit further from the sort of the center of where the original events surrounding Jesus had unfolded. So I think it's just a result of that and nothing to do with any kind of conspiracy. Once we get past once we get into the late New Testament period, there's some possible candidates. And once we get beyond that, very early on, we have Gentiles contributing to the writing process. So I don't think there was any attempt to stifle them. And that's not least because the movement that would have been most opposed to Gentile Christians having a voice in this movement is the one that we actually have least well represented in the New Testament, right? Paul's version, which is allowing Gentiles in on an even playing field, is the one that predominates in the New Testament. And so that movement, I think, was likely to exclude such people on principle from contributing. It's interesting that a predominantly Gentile church in a later time, as the canon is debated by what then is a predominantly Gentile church, ends up with a predominantly Jewish Bible, though. And that, unfortunately, did not prevent the church from being deeply anti-Semitic at many times throughout its history.
Do we happen to know how Paul and Jesus looked like?
We don't. We have a fascinating description of Paul in a work known as the Acts of Paul and Thecla. right? And it says he looked like an angel, but what it actually says about the size of his nose and his unibrow and things like that are not how I envisaged angels ever, and still not. It's a fascinating text. It's not in the New Testament, and it's been suggested on the one hand that might reflect somebody actually having passed on some memory of what Paul looked like, because it doesn't seem particularly complimentary, and yet the text seems to be fond of Paul. On the other hand, some have said that these features that to us might not sound so endearing would have been viewed positively by ancient people. So there are debates even about that, as you'll see, but nothing in the New Testament. They weren't focused on what these individuals looked like. In the case of John the Baptist, because there's this allusion to him, and I know the person didn't ask about this, or maybe it was your follow-up question, I'm not sure, but in the case of John the Baptist, we're told things that suggest that he, like Samuel and Samson in the stories in the Jewish scriptures, was a lifelong Nazirite. So in other words, he didn't cut his hair. And so in his case, at least, we might be able to say something about his hair, if nothing else.
I'd like to shift now to the kind of back to the synoptic problem we talked a bit about a little earlier about how does one know that Mark is the first gospel? But how does one know that Matthew and Luke didn't know each other and that they required another source for their material in common not found in Mark?
Right. The short answer is we don't know that, right? And if I said otherwise, you'd get Mark Goodacre back on here to set things straight. That's one of the things that there's debate about. There's much more agreement that Mark wrote first for a variety of reasons than that Matthew and Luke did not know one another. The two main views are that Matthew and Luke did not know each other, but used a common source that explains the things that they share in common that aren't in Mark. And the other view is probably in second place, or maybe is bumped into first place. It's always hard to tell, right? Because opinions shift, and nobody does up-to-date surveys on these things. And when we try to do it online, we never know whether it's getting a representative sample. But the other view is that Luke used Matthew and Mark. And in my thinking, right, one of the things that makes me think that's unlikely is that sometimes Luke's version seems, as we might put it, more primitive, right, more original. Matthew seems to be expanding what we have in Luke rather. The other thing is that we have these different accounts of the infancy. We have in Acts and in Matthew different accounts of how Judas dies. And I would expect some of those things not necessarily to be the same if one of them knew the other directly, but I would expect there to be some more content in there that helps the reader know what to do with the differences between the stories, right? There are places where a gospel author inserts something or moves something, and it's done in a way that if you knew where it was originally, you can see what they did and can sort of follow it and can maybe understand why. And the difficulty that we have fitting the infancy stories in Matthew and Luke together, if we try to trace the geographical movements, it's hard to explain why those would come about if Matthew and Luke were directly dependent, so that one of them knew the other. But it's not out of the question. And I've spent enough time thinking about this lately and pondering it to wonder if there is still something new that could be said on this subject. And so I don't know what my next big academic research project will be, but something to do with the synoptic problem is one of the ones I've been thinking about.
And can you tell us about the burial of Jesus?
Yes, and actually, my book on the burial of Jesus is actually going to be re-released by Whitfenstock, so I'm really excited and looking forward to that. The burial of Jesus often gets sort of breezed past, and you can understand why. Christian theology has placed a lot of focus on the cross and the resurrection, and I mean the crucifixion and then the stories about Easter are the natural place to pay attention, and so people skip the stuff that they perceive as linking things. But the question of how Jesus was buried I think, is an important one as we're thinking about how did early Christian belief in the resurrection arise? Why did they believe what they believed? And so, on the one hand, I think Jesus probably was buried. Burial was required by Jewish law. And so Josephus says that even the crucified, they made a point of burying. There may have been circumstances in war and other things where that was either not feasible for practical reasons or prevented. But in general, that was their practice. And Paul mentions it just in passing, that he was buried. If he was buried, it was in a criminal's tomb near this execution site. Our earliest account in Mark tells us that Joseph of Arimathea, who's not yet turned into a disciple, he's a righteous member of the Jewish leading council. He makes sure that the bare minimum the law requires is done. And so Jesus is buried in a tomb, it says, and wrapped in a linen sheet. And there's no anointing. That's why we have a story of a woman pouring some perfume on him, and it's interpreted as anointing beforehand for burial. And then we have women going to the tomb supposedly to anoint him afterwards. None of those stories makes any sense if Jesus was anointed for burial when he was buried. As we trace the development, we see that the tomb gets cleaner. It's a brand new one. The linen sheet gets cleaner. And by the time we get to the Gospel of John, Nicodemus, another member of the Jewish ruling council, is collaborating with Joseph, and they're using like a wheelbarrow full of spices to give him a burial fit for a king. And so we can trace how the story develops over time across these different texts. And understanding how it started helps us get away from misunderstandings, as well as to understand why this experience was so traumatic, and why, if you're a historian looking for explanations of how beliefs arose that don't entail the supernatural, then understanding the trauma of Jesus not merely being executed in a dishonorable way, but not being buried in a way that was felt to be dignified and worthy of him, how that would have affected his followers, right? Mark Goodacre has written an article recently that mirrors some things that I and others have said, that therefore we shouldn't talk about the empty tomb, right? Even if you're persuaded that the disciples went early on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion and didn't find Jesus' body there. If this was a tomb for criminals to be buried in, then undoubtedly Jesus was not the first person or the last person to be placed in it.
Bagi says, I recently read the Eucharist would not have been part of the early church, as Jews would find eating the body and drinking the blood, even symbolically, abhorrent. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. And so I mentioned the didache, and the question of whether the question of how the meal that seems to have been, right, according to at least the sort of predominant depiction in the Gospels, was a Passover meal, relates to words that Jesus might have said in relation to it, how the Eucharistic practice of the early church may have related to his more general meal practice. All of that is very puzzling. The didache that I mentioned earlier has symbolic words that don't connect with the death and the death of Jesus, but it's about the bringing together as one body. It's bringing together the wheat to become one loaf, and then emphasis on the vine and the vine of David and things like that. And it's interesting that we have, in connection with these things, even in Paul and even in John's Gospel, which doesn't have a Eucharist, we have dwelling in me, I am the vine, you are the branches. We have Paul talking about how it's a denial of the body, as in the body of Jesus, the unity of this group, when they're divided, when they come together for this important meal. And so how much of that language would have been taken to mean anything like, what it came to mean in terms of, not just consubstantiation, but in terms of eating flesh and drinking blood. It's fascinating that when we get this in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 6, it causes a lot of people leave, right, who are following Jesus, according to that story. And what Jesus says in response in the Gospel of John is fascinating, right? He says, you know, the flesh counts for nothing. It's the spirit that gives life. Right? And this whole passage has been based on, right, as there's been echoes of Jewish scriptures. We're told that it was a synagogue sermon, right? And it has quotations from the Torah and then from the prophets. And it seems to be echoing this language from the second part of the book of Isaiah, in which the word of God comes down from heaven and accomplishes what God intended. And so I think a lot of this, any notion that they were actually, even symbolically, eating the body, drinking the blood, probably doesn't come in, even when they're using language that could be interpreted that way. But it's a difficult question. One of the other things I've been thinking about possibly doing as a future research topic, maybe near future, is the question of what Jesus himself thought and whether we can figure that out. It's not impossible that in view of John the Baptist's execution, that he might have been able to foresee that he himself was destined to meet a similar end. Whether he would have uttered words that had to do with, consuming flesh and blood, I don't know. And it seems to me much easier to make sense of those words as meaning something like we might say where, this fellowship, right? Partaking of this bread and of this cup, and doing this together, this like saying something like, this is my lifeblood, right? This is the essence of me. This is my body. And perhaps at some point he did say something to that effect. And then after the crucifixion, it was taken in a different direction. But the language certainly did come to be difficult and did come to be taken very literally in some traditions and not at all literally in others. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Well, it sounded helpful to me.
Okay, good.
Michael E., thank you for your super chat. What is your current opinion on the Talpia tome?
Yeah, it's a fascinating case. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a site where in what's now a neighborhood of Jerusalem, like would have been sort of a neighboring village, I think, in Jesus' time. And there's this tomb that had some ossuaries in it, bone boxes in it, which had names like, Jesus, son of Joseph, right? That's not the only bone box with that combination of names we found, because that's Joshua, son of Joe, right? It's not Josh, son of Joe. You're going to have more than one of those when those are common names. But there are also other names, right? There's a Judah, son of Jesus. There's a one that has been interpreted in a variety of ways. But, one of the suggestions was that it was saying, either Mary, who is the master, or Mary and Martha. But then we also have, right, there's this place on the Mount of Olives where we have some things that connect with some of the names of disciples, things like that. And so whether any of these actually reflects the early Christian movement's activity is hard to say. If it could be demonstrated by chemical analysis, as some have been trying to do, that the James ossuary came from there and that the inscription on it was authentic, then I think you'd have to say that the combination of a James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and a Jesus, son of Joseph, and various other things, it would have to be authentic. But it's not clear, right? We haven't had, to my knowledge, and of course I'm not an archaeologist, but we haven't had studies that have shown that you can localize the precise makeup of soil and of mineral deposits on ossuaries and other things made of stone, so that you can determine that sort of thing. And so it's a fascinating case, but as of yet, I'm not persuaded that it is a place where Jesus was buried. And part of the reason is that I think that if, given how concerned they were with burying Jesus and their failure to be able to bury him as they thought he deserved, I think that if they had managed to bury Jesus as they thought he deserved somewhere, then the story would have, the stories and the early Christian movement would have unfolded in a different way.
And in my closing question, is it possible to know, or at least to suggest a high probability that Jesus said any of the things attributed to him in the double tradition?
And interesting, the double tradition. So the stuff that's in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And there too, right, the question of whether those things come from an early source of some sort, sometimes thought of as a collection of sayings, although there are narrative things in there. But whether those teachings, right, that we find embedded in the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, things like the Lord's Prayer, I think we can. Sometimes it's relatively limited, right? I think that the prayer addressing God as Father, given that we also have in Mark's Gospel Jesus addressing God as Abba, we have Paul mentioning to non-Aramaic speaking Christians in a Greek letter, nonetheless working in this Aramaic word Abba. I think the only reason he would have done so is that word had already been mentioned, had been part of storytelling, was well known. And so when we see that convergence of details, it indicates likelihood of authenticity. In other places, right, I mean, we're definitely at best dealing with the translation of things Jesus said, and we have variations across Matthew and Luke, and whichever solution to the synoptic problem one adopts, it doesn't sort out ultimately the question of what the original form was, because even if Luke used Matthew, Luke might still have heard some things and reverted them to the form in which he always heard them, and so might preserve an earlier version of things. But once again, right, there are things in there that there was no reason for the later church to invent. There are things in there that are difficult teachings from the perspective of what the church ended up doing. And those things are always going to seem more likely than not to have been preserved despite their awkwardness, because they actually were remembered as coming from Jesus and circulated widely and were widely known as such.
Let's take this question as the last one for today. Mitzvah Golem, thank you for your question. Why are there hundreds of variant versions of the Christian Bibles? None used to match the original Koine Greek New Testament or Hebrew Scriptures sources.
Okay, that's a very strangely worded question, but let's see if I can make sense of it. Right, so there are lots of copies of the Christian Bible, and when copies are made of any works by hand, there are errors because these are human beings who are copying them, and that's how that process works. And so there's nothing surprising about that. In terms of why none of them match the original Koine Greek, I mean, if we had the original Koine Greek New Testament, right, if we had the original copies of things, then we would be able to say, here it is. If the question is, why are none of these manuscripts exactly like the eclectic text of the Greek New Testament that you get as a published edition? Well, the reason is because scholars conclude that, this particular reading here seems more likely to be original. That reading there seems more likely to be original. But yeah, there has been a move towards paying more attention to, what would your impression of this text be if you had this particular manuscript, and to actually do a bit of that. I'm not sure that I've answered this person's question because of the way it's worded, but the reason that we have lots of variant versions is because they are copied by hand, as was true of all ancient literature. And so there's nothing really surprising there.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James McGrath.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Jacob. It's great. And given how many interests we share in common, I'm sure this will not be our last conversation.
Agreed. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.